podium will be Hal Cooper, who is an internationally renowned rail engineer, consultant, who has worked all around the world and has now been I'd say the leading specialist in North America on the Bering Strait rail. So he's going to say a few words on that.
Thank you for the kind introduction. It's great to be back in Vancouver again. In fact, I have two guests here. My fellow student from the University of Washington was working on my master's degree on pulp and paper, Alvin Chemelauskas, and his son, Jay Chemelauskas, who I understand is now the king of lithium. He's working on lithium batteries for cars, which I guess is, instead of helium-3, we have lithium-3. So there we are elementally. No pun intended. I'm here today to talk about primarily rail infrastructure and associated water and energy, but before we get started, this conference has been, except for me, about fusion, and actually I may be the only person in this room or in the LaRouche organization who has ever designed a power plant based on fusion, and it was actually at Hanford to take care of the large amounts of wastewater underneath the site of the 200 area, which had large plumes of tritium, which was going into the Columbia River. And when I was working for the Washington Department of Ecology on the Hanford cleanup, I noticed this and sat down and worked out a design. And I took it to the various superiors, both at the Department of Energy and the State Department of Ecology, and their answer was very interesting. Listen, this is too advanced, and this is a solution. We really don't want to talk about this, so why don't you just put that away? And I guess that sort of was the forerunner of where we are today attitudinally in the United States as far as technological progress, which is we don't want to see any. And with that, and I'm going to be talking a lot about oil and gas and coal in this presentation. And I think in funding the fusion programs that we have, I have a suggestion. We take all this new shale gas and oil that's being developed in the United States. I've been working for almost the last 2 years in North Dakota on waste remediation with the Bakken Formation and the Eagle Ford Shale in Texas and so forth, and also from the Athabasca tar sands up here in Canada and in Alberta. And we put a tax on that of $5 or $10 a barrel, and we use that to fund advanced energy technologies, and that would give us all the money we need to study fusion and other things. Now, let's get on with the presentation. This past April, Dr. Wenmin Chu in China, who obviously was authorized by the Chinese government, made a proposal to build a high-speed rail line between Beijing and Los Angeles with an extension to Chicago. And the Chinese government said, we will pledge $550 billion to this, and we don't need anybody else's money. Now, this was published in the London Guardian, it was published in the New York Times, and it was published in the Washington Post, and nothing more was ever said about it anywhere in the United States. I suspect someone similar publicity was done in Canada as well. However, in China and Russia, the day after this announcement was made, I received a call from a reporter at the Rio Novosti newspaper, which is published in Moscow, from their correspondent in Washington, D.C., who asked me what was my opinion about this. And I said, well, the Bering Strait Tunnel project is never going to get put back under the rug again, ever. And that's what this diagram is about. What would we build? Well, I'm going to show you there. And of course, the key is the connection between the eastern and the western hemispheres is at the Bering Strait. So we're looking at a Pacific orientation of the world rather than Atlantic. And of course, this dying Atlantic financial system that we've heard all about today is very much a factor in that, and the rising one is the Pacific, and the key linchpin is the Bering Strait Tunnel. So it is very much a political enterprise here as well as a civil engineering project. Let's go to the next one. Now, this is what would look in North America and South America. Connected the Bering Strait through Alaska, through the Yukon Territory, Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, down into the United States, and of course a line going down the west coast to Los Angeles, and ultimately into Latin America, and another line coming down through the Central Plains, and another one going to Chicago in the south. Interestingly enough, the government in Mexico has just issued a request for proposals for a high-speed rail corridor between Mexico City and Querétaro and there is a private group that is working with the government of Mexico to build a high-speed rail corridor between Monterrey and Nuevo Laredo at the U.S.-Mexico border, in which they hope will be able to go up into San Antonio, Texas. So these are things that are already publicly announced by the government of Mexico. President Enrique Peña Nieto is, of course, the leader of this. And of course, Mexico has recently decided that it's going to push private investment in its oil and gas sector. And of course, they'll be following very much the lead of Canada and the United States. And those of you, the gentleman who I think gave a very accurate assessment of the present state of fusion technology, it's not going to happen in the next 2 weeks. It's not going to happen in the next 2 years. What do we do in the meantime? Yes, we need more nuclear power, and I think the Chinese are leading the way. Sadly, the United States used to lead the way, but it doesn't anymore. And in a way, Canada, who had its own reactors that used the CANDU system that didn't generate plutonium waste, that all went by the wayside too, and it should not have. And I think Canada needs to reactivate that program if they aren't already, and I haven't heard that mentioned today, but it needs to be. Now, let's go to the next slide. And this is another view of the same system. Next one. North American Water and Power Alliance. This idea was actually proposed by the Ralph Parsons Company back in the early 1960s and funded through the Parsons Foundation. And it was picked up by President Kennedy and advocated, and unfortunately when he died, the political support began to evaporate, and by the end of the 1960s, it went away. Senator Frank Moss from Utah was a strong supporter. And today, what we need is to take this excess water that's in the north and move it to the south. California has a very serious drought problem. I noticed just yesterday that the federal court was asked to overturn the decision to favor the water of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta for fish preservation and not use it for farming, and the farmers have sued. We'll see what happens there. And we also have through the Midwest down into Texas, coming from Canada and Dakota, and this is an idea that's been there for a long time. The flows in the Mackenzie and the Yukon River are very large, and of course, most of that goes out into either the North Pacific or the Arctic. Next slide, please. Now, mention about Russia. Russia already has a very advanced program underway to build its rail system from the Trans-Siberian Railway in Amur province all the way out to the Bering Strait of Ulan, the eastern and Chukotka region. I have been in both of those places, as well as in Yakutsk, which is in the center point of the Sahara Republic. It's the capital, but it's on the Lena River, city of about 250,000, in an area with very, very rich minerals. They claim every element on the face of the earth is in that region. So, but there is a very organized plan. The first part, the first 500 miles, has already been built from Tinda all the way to Yakutsk. They're trying to figure out how they're going to go across, whether it's a bridge or a tunnel to get into Yakutsk from the east side of the river. Any of you that have been there, it's a pretty cold place in the wintertime, as it is here, but just more so. And they are planning to build out to the Magadan region, which is on the coast, and then going to a line that will connect to Kamchatka, and then finally a line to Chukotka over a 20-year period. No similar effort is going on in North America, either Canada or the United States. Next slide. This is a diagram of the major railroads that either are already in operation or are planning to be built in Russia. And interestingly enough, you see that line along the Arctic Ocean that actually goes from Vorkuta all the way out to Ulan. Believe it or not, under Stalin's time, feasibility studies were done of that entire route, and the entire route was laid out, and it exists today, and only small parts of it were built. Interestingly enough, that route railroad was designed to connect the concentration camps, which is where they put people, and most of that was for mineral extraction. Similarly, at Magadan, which was the headquarters of all the concentration camp of the former Soviet Union administration, they had mining operations ran under the same system, and they had planned the railroad all the way out to the Bering Strait, and do this back prior to World War II. Next slide. Now, here is what we would propose, and I'm sorry for the quality of the map here, but it shows a lot of the lines that would be there. We're showing here connecting to the oil fields in Fort McMurray. Interestingly enough, I don't know how many of you in Canada are aware, but there's a large formation of oil. It's called the Cannell Formation in the Northwest Territories. It centers on Fort Norman. When I was working in North Dakota with the Fort Berthold Indian Tribe, a delegation came down from the First Nations in the Northwest Territories and spent almost a week with us across the state from Alcan all the way to Wales for constructing the railway. But they haven't done anything to build it, unfortunately. Go ahead. Next slide. This is the similar system on the Asian side, and particularly in Russia and China, because there is very extensive efforts now to build railroad lines, and that is an ongoing effort. It isn't something they're talking about. They're already doing it, and a lot of it has to do with economic development. And of course, they're planning the day when they'll be going to the Bering Strait and connecting to North America, and that will be a double-track railroad line and a 4-lane highway with electric transmission, natural gas pipelines, and probably fiber optic communications as well. So they're already planning for the future in a way, sadly, we in North America are not. Next slide. Now, here's what a possible bridge across the Lena River between Hafnigan and Twaga, just to the south of Yakutsk, would look like. I had the artist Craig Thorpe do that. I was in Yakutsk in 1996 for 2 weeks. And we were working with the Saha government there on the expansion of the railroad, and this was an artist's conception that was put into the feasibility study did for the Republic government back in 1997. Next slide, please. This is what the Bering, and I apologize for the artistry work here. This is a horizontal and vertical view of the Bering Strait Tunnel. It's 53 miles across. The tunnel would be about 65 miles long. There's mountain ranges on each side that have to be dealt with. There's 2 islands out in the middle, Big Diomede, a Little Diomede Island. And on each side, you would have lines going on the Alaska side to Nome, and there's no place like Nome. I was there in the year 2001 for an international conference between the Chukotkin and Alaska governments. And it's a town of about 4,000 people whose primary function in life is it's the medical center for Western Alaska for the native people. And Providence I have not been in, but it's a town of about 2,000 people. If you're going to go into Chukotka, that's the border crossing point. You can go either by air or boat. Believe it or not, there's a boat service that goes from Nome to Providence, but it's on a special charter basis. Next slide. This is what a conception of the east side of the Bering Strait Tunnel would look like at Wales, Alaska, in this case a 3-track, and we have a Russian-looking locomotive, and we have a container train, and the Russian train will be carrying oil, tank cars, and we would have a passenger train. We have an issue of gauges. Our gauge is 4 feet, 8.5 inches, and so is China's, and Russia's is 5 feet even, and it's just enough. You can't run from one to the other. So my suggestion is when they get over to Russia to build this, they build 2 regular standard gauge tracks and plus 2 Russian gauge tracks so they can go directly to China. And I think Russia is going to have to face up to the fact that if it wants to be hauling a lot of cargoes across the country to earn revenue instead of sending it by ship around, that they're going to need to have a standard gauge lines on the Trans-Siberian and Bengal and Baikal, which is strong. Next slide. This is our North American system, which I had shown earlier in color. And I want to emphasize on the west coast and coming through Vancouver, this proposal of the Chinese, which would actually go along that. They did not specify a route, but it obviously would need to go on something parallel to what I'm showing you here, connecting Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, Sacramento, and the Bay Area, and Southern California with Los Angeles as well. And I think in the future we're going to need to be thinking about connecting into Mexico and even to Central and South America, because there's a similar crossing point of importance to the Bering Strait Tunnel at the Darien Gap between Panama and Colombia. Next slide. And this is another view of the, and I again apologize for the artwork, it's the railroads, and also the red is showing the water, because that's the North American Water and Power Alliance. We do have serious problems with water in the Colorado River Basin, all of the Colorado River states, California and Texas, and particularly in California now. And yet in some parts of the country we're getting too much rain. Next slide. And this is another view. And this actually was showing the previous proposal for a natural gas pipeline, which when I did the feasibility study on
Alaska-Canada Railroad back in 2003 through 2006 was very much on the agenda, but unfortunately for it now, it's probably not going to happen. But you do see the Cano Formation shown, and of course there's all the large oil reserves in Alberta associated with the Athabasca tar sands and the Cold Lake and the Peace River. And there's up to 9 trillion barrels of oil in that formation. So it's a huge, provided we can solve the environmental problems. And my belief is that when we talk about fusion power as a means of generating energy, I think it's only half the benefits. The other half is treating water. And I think it's going to prove to be a very effective desalination technology, and we ought to be looking at that as well as energy production. So those of you who are working on the fusion part, which I'm not, I think certainly should take a look at that. Thank you. Next. Now, the West Coast Corridor. This is showing coming down from Vancouver to Los Angeles and what are the route options. We should be running the freight trains down the Cascade foothills from Sumas down to Tenino, south of Olympia, and not go through Seattle and leave that for passenger trains. We're already having a big issue with coal and oil trains coming through, and it's going to get to be more of a factor than it was. And then in Oregon, the line on the Deschutes River going down to California, either to Sacramento by way of the east side of the Sierra Mountains or on the west side, are 2 different lines, and I think probably freight and passengers should be separate. California is building a high-speed rail, or planning to, in the San Joaquin Valley in southern and California to the Bay Area. It's somewhat bogged down in politics, but they are going ahead with the first work. And also we have the interior routes to consider as well. All those can connect Canada with the United States and Mexico. Next slide. This is an elevation profile going from the border near Vancouver down to Tijuana. And as you can see, we have some big mountains to go across, but we have some tunnels to build. And I had to kind of compress this to show it, but it does show you where your major terrain issues are. The Siskiyou Mountains and the Tehachapi Mountains in Southern California as big barriers. We got to build tunnels, build lots of. Next slide. I'm talking about the Cascade Foothills Corridor, and connecting from Canada down. The Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway is going to be faced with a need to put a lot of additional capacity. They have already found in North Dakota that they were way, way, way behind the 8 ball, and now we have a problem that the farmers are all complaining we don't have enough capacity to handle our grain and fertilizer, and we're handling too much oil, and basically the problem is they don't have enough tracks, and they got to build lots of them, and we need to get the oil trains and the coal trains so that they don't go through Seattle or Portland. That's going to require a lot of infrastructure. Next slide. And this is another view of the Cascade Foothills Corridor. I had a meeting with the coal terminal people who want to build 3 coal terminals in the state of Washington 2 weeks ago. And I showed this to them, and their reaction was, well, no one is even considering this. And I said, what happens if there's so much protesting in Seattle you can't get the coal trains to go through anymore? Oh, well, we're still not going to consider this. And I said, well, you need to, but at the same time, the announcement's been made, and I'm sure all of you up here in Vancouver know that they are expanding the port capacity at Roberts Bank for coal, and there's going to be a lot more coming. And in the state of Washington, we may fight the coal terminals, and they may never get built, but the trains are still going to come through there because they're going to end up going to Vancouver instead of in the state of Washington. Next slide. And in Oregon, we need to build additional lines as well, and also we need to be thinking about pumping water to the south from the Columbia River, adding it in up at the upstream end of Mica Dam in British Columbia, which would solve all those problems with the fights over salmon and everything else, and we can increase the capacity of the Columbia River, hydroelectric capacity, by probably 30 to 40%. But again, it also, we have the issue of plenty of cooling water for the nuclear reactors, and we should go back to the plan of Patel in 1979 to build 21 nuclear reactors in Hanford, and that would be the center of this new nuclear capacity project program that's been made by the Nuclear Commission. And that includes a complete nuclear fuel cycle, including reprocessing and enrichment. Next slide. California. They're proposing to build a high-speed rail. They have actually built their aqueduct a number of years ago. Right now, they don't have enough water to put in, but they need to. And they have a very large oil development called the Monterey Shale, and it seems to me that can be developed in the near term. And we should have nuclear reactors to desalt the water, and eventually they may need to be fusion as well. Next slide. And this is a proposal for the Grapevine Tunnel south of Bakersfield, north of Los Angeles. That would need to be a very essential part of that. But unfortunately, right now, that's not being considered. But the high-speed rail system, they are planning a line from Palmdale over there down to Burbank as a new tunnel, which will go under the San Gabriel Mountains. Next slide. And there's a view of the Grapevine Tunnel, looking at it from the north to the south of Bakersfield, the Grapevine, as it goes to the south towards Los Angeles. And we probably could haul some oil on that as well. So next slide. And that's the coast route. This is the alternative, and believe it or not, there's now so much traffic in the San Joaquin Valley on the trains that they're sending the oil trains south, and there's oil moving from North Dakota down to refineries not only in the Bay Area, but inside California. Next slide. And this is the proposed tunnel with Cuesta Pass north of San Luis Obispo to Santa Margarita, which is 9 miles long. Next slide. And that's a profile of the Coast Range with the tunnels at Santa Susana and Cuesta Pass. Next slide. And in Mexico, this shows you where the oil-fired power plants are. The coal-fired, they actually have one large nuclear plant as well. They may be planning to build some more, but if they also are looking at major development of their natural gas as well as oil reserves. And the oil is primarily off the coast in the Gulf of Mexico, but the gas formations are primarily just to the south of the U.S. border in Texas, going all the way down to near Veracruz. Next slide. And we need a connection between South America and Central America, going to North America, for a rail of the Darien Gap, which has some very big swamps and mountain problems to deal with, and that's something else that can be dealt with in the future, but that's in the future. But I think that, in fact, they need to develop a rail system through Central America. They're already planning to build additional electric power transmission, but they need more power plants, and they need economic development so that we don't have all these people coming in desperation to the United States, because there's no jobs in the north. However, it isn't in my slide, but I don't know how many of you are aware that there's been an agreement made by the Chinese with the Nicaraguan government to build a canal across Nicaragua, in addition to the Panama Canal, which would double the size of the proposed expansion of the Panama Canal. And in addition to that, the Chinese have offered to help expand the capacity of the increased size of the Panama Canal even above where it is now. Next slide. And that's a view of the Darien Gap near Matidi, Panama, and southern Panama. Next slide. And there was a proposal, believe it or not, many years ago, back in the 1880s, under the Grover Cleveland administration, to develop an integrated rail network between North America and South America. And that continued to be considered up to the time when William McKinley was assassinated. It was rumored that was done because the British people didn't want that. Next slide. And this is where we would have aqueducts and railroad lines together with the possibility of hauling oil or water across the country. But when we did our economic analysis, it worked great for oil, but not for water. Next slide. And this would be the same thing for integrating it in with the North American Water Powers to try to start it. But I think we've got a big job on our hands getting the North American Water Power lines built. We need to. Next slide. And this is the feed system in the north from Alaska and Yukon Territory, Northwest Territories south into the United States. Next slide. And this is the proposal to build a line along the Great Plains to pump water from Nebraska south to Texas and deal with Texas's very serious drought problem and the need to add water back into the old aquifer. Next slide. And this is the proposal in California and Oregon to pump water to the south and also add it to the Snake as well as the Columbia River and the Sacramento River. Next slide. And this is the same thing showing the main canals across Oregon. Next slide. And there is a view of what the canal would look like in the San Joaquin Valley with high speed next to a well train. Next slide. And that's northeastern California's rail proposal through the mountains and the water, because actually water would go from Goose Lake south into the Sacramento River, and then we would alleviate all these fights over salmon and so forth with farming in the the San Joaquin Valley. Next slide. And Governor Brown proposed building a water tunnel from Portland on the Sacramento, which is about 20 miles south of Sacramento, down to Tracy, which is where the existing intake to the California aqueduct is. And that would be two 24-foot diameter tunnels, being able to pump up to 20 million acre-feet a year of water into their systems, and California needs it right now. And this was designed to prevent saltwater intrusion into the bay, and we need to have more water coming into the river so we don't have more saltwater intrusion and destroy the farms in the San Joaquin Valley's Sacramento Delta. Next slide. And this is all the various lines in the San Joaquin Valley in California, rail and water, and for your edification. The next slide. These are the water projects proposals. And that actually came from a National Geographic, which I superimposed the proposed aqueducts on. And if there's a state that needs a water problem solved right now, it's California. Next slide. And the Monterey Shale superimposed, because when you drill for wells in the San Joaquin Valley, it takes about 150,000 gallons of water to drill a well. And you get approximately 15 million gallons of brine water coming up from the oil. So you've got a problem. It isn't the one they're talking about with stealing the water, but it's sure a problem with dealing with the waste, and that's one of the things where fusion desalination might come in. Next slide. And that's another view showing where that oil is, where this huge area of 300,000 acres of land that's no longer available to grow crops because the irrigation wastewater has risen to the level near the ground where it poisons the roots of the plants, and you can't grow crops anymore. And you need to solve that and get rid of that problem. Next slide. And that's another view of the western states with water and pumping the water from the Columbia River to California. Next slide. And this is going in with the Colorado River, the same thing, and also shown in Texas what it would look like as well, and in New Mexico. Next slide. And that's the rail where we would haul oil, and that would also include from the tar sands oil, which is actually now being brought by rail down into the Bay Area refineries to Benicia. Next slide. And this is a previous proposal of the former Atomic Energy Commission to build up to 42 nuclear reactors for desalting water as well as generating power. This proposal was made in 1955. Next slide. And this is the Columbia River Basin, where we need to deal with the question of the water and what we're going to do to pump water. And we need to add enough additional water so Canada and the United States don't need to fight anymore over who has a shortage of water. Because both of them have very legitimate claims, but there just isn't enough water to meet them without building the Milwaukee project. Next slide. And there's the Ogallala Aquifer, which covers 7 states in the Great Plains. And in Texas, it's running out of water. It badly needs to be recharged. And we're going to have outside sources of water to solve the problem, along the Ogallala Aquifer in California and also throughout Texas and New Mexico. Next slide. Oil production. Alberta's going up, and it's going to, if projections are met, it could be as much as 6 million barrels a day by 2030, 5 million in Texas, 2 million in North Dakota, maybe more, and California, or 3 million, excuse me, in California could be as much as 2 million. And maybe that's where our money needs to come to fund all that advanced research on fusion. Next slide. The railroad system to haul oil, which I worked on a lot. In fact, I just put together a report for the Puget Sound Regional Council in Seattle on what we can do with the oil trains. And we have to build some bypass lines, and we don't want the oil trains going through Spokane or Seattle or Portland. It's just not a good idea. Everybody knows properly about it. Next slide. And this is a waste treatment system for brine water. Next slide. And then, if you had a nuclear power plant, we would also have, when it was on the previous, but this is the detail of the water treatment system. And next slide. And then this is where the nuclear reactor is, where we could use it as the basis providing the energy for the water. And we're thinking about fission here, but it could be fusion as well in the future. And I think fusion has a real potential for desalting water. Thank you. Next slide. And this is these desalination plants with these proposed water projects as shown as possibilities. And of course that would add water for power production for pumping water. Next slide. And I'm one of the authors of the owners of the CEFCO process, which just cleans up coal so it can be used for power generation. and providing enough additional byproducts that it actually is a profitable emission control system, and it's been bitterly fought by the electric utility industry in the United States. We actually are talking with the Canadian Clean Coal Coalition over in Calgary at this point. Next slide. And there's California's transmission. The next slide. And these are the transmission lines for the United States and in the different regions, and showing where potential nuclear complexes could be built in Hanford, Alberta, into the Sound Valley. Next slide. And this is a superconducting cable transmission. And next slide. And this is, we're getting about to the end. This is this proposal with a detail showing lots of rail lines to be built to for the system to connect the Bering Strait with the Daring Dam. Next slide. And there, with magnetic levitation guideways, something like maybe what China's proposing. I don't know exactly what they proposed, but they made with magnetic levitation. Next slide. And there's our final system. And then we have one more, I think. And the water systems for the Nuapa and extensions into Mexico. Next slide. And our famous rail network for the world, which I started and everybody else has picked up on. That I'm glad. Next slide. And that's your final word. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got 10 minutes of questions.
Sure.
Yeah.
I was just wondering how, if that Trans-Texas corridor, if that's a part of that, or is that a separate design, or what is that all about?
The Trans-Texas corridor was proposed by Governor Perry in 2002, and evidently some of my earlier work in Texas led to that, although they didn't give me any credit. It's probably just a result. The project was canceled in 2009. And the reason was they were going to have 1,000-foot wide swaths of land going all across Texas, and the landowner said, no, you're not going to do that.
No.
And it wasn't really that responsible a proposal. And it was also a way for bringing trucks in from Mexico to the United States, so we didn't have to pay those wages. Sadly, that was a part of it that they didn't talk about, and it got killed. That's my answer to your question. Yes, sir. Ma'am. Yes, go ahead.
Right. Well, I mean, I noticed there that you're talking about Russia and China are already quite advanced in this process, and North America is realistically kind of yet to start. I mean, I assume that comes down to when you look at the the styles of government in the East as compared to the West. What's it going to take to get this sort of thing happening in the West? I mean, what's the catalyst? I mean, it seems that it's...
It may involve private financing to get it started, because we seem to have a paralytic government in the United States now.
Yeah, and so that was my point that I'm trying to get to. I mean, it seems to be, it all looks fantastic and it looks well researched, but it's like how catalyst actually.
Well, I think probably the key is the fact that, right now you're seeing a need for major investment, particularly by Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad. And maybe what's going to cause this to happen is palm oil. Because you're going to have a problem with Keystone Pipeline. You already are. The problem isn't necessarily stated, but it's Warren Buffett, who owns the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, doesn't want any competition. It's very simple what the problem is. And he seems to have the inside track with Brock, and so we're there. And the Canadian railroads are kicking and screaming, getting into the oil hauling business, frankly. BNSF has really moved down aggressively, but unfortunately, while they did that, they didn't increase their infrastructure enough and the tracks, and now they're spending lots and lots of money trying to fix it, and it's going to be a while before it gets fixed. And I know, having rid on the Empire Builder numerous times between Seattle and North Dakota, on my experience working in the oil over there in North Dakota, we were late all the time. Anywhere from 3 to 17 hours to 5 to 8 hours late was just part of the course. And you didn't have to figure it out too well what the problem was. There's so many trains out there. I mean, it was getting to the point that they didn't have enough crews to run the trains. I mean, it was getting that bad. And they had to go on a massive crash program. And the interesting thing was, those of us who told them back in 2004 and 2005, there was all this oil sitting underneath North Dakota. I remember I was at a freight mobility roundtable meeting in Seattle in 2004 when we had a guy from the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Road who got up and said they did not ever expect to see in the future a measurable increase in freight traffic across North Dakota. They were talking only about agriculture. And I asked him, I said, have you factored in the Bakken Formation? Oh yeah. He knew about it, but he didn't know much about it. And when he finished, I said, listen, everybody,
There's more oil sitting underneath North Dakota than is sitting underneath Saudi Arabia. One of these days it's going to get developed, and my guess is the BNSF Railway is going to be involved in that, whether they want to be or not. Well, they sure are, and they've decided to haul oil trains instead of grain trains, and now they've got all the farmers in North Dakota out there. So it's a problem, it's a big problem, and that's probably going to start this. And you know, if we haul oil, my feeling is if you want to build the Bering Strait Tunnel, the most important thing you do is to get the most important single province in Canada on the team, and that's Alberta, and say all that oil, forget all the pipelines, and have Trans-Canada and Enbridge, instead of building pipelines and fighting with the First Nations and the environmental groups here and all up and down the coast of British Columbia and Christy Clark and all that, why don't we just put it on the train and ship it to China, and when it comes out at the other end, it's at the refinery, and we never have to worry. But what do we have to build? The answer is the Bering Strait Tunnel. Now, there's also huge coal reserves in Northwest Alaska, North Lake. Probably 30 to 40% of what's in North America. It's there. It's good quality coal, 12,000 BTU a pound, 1/10% sulfur. All the damn stuff is China. And you've got enough to justify it right there, building it. Now, but I personally think when it gets right down to it, the most important single group is going to be the province of Alberta. If they say we need this, it's going to happen. Otherwise, I think it's going to be a real uphill battle. But if the oil companies decide in their infinite wisdom we need to haul the oil to China, it's going to happen. That's my opinion. And that'll take care of your whole thing. I mean, we have, you know, you can haul up to 150 million barrels a day of oil to China from Alberta.
Yeah.
And not even make a dent in the production that is forecasted in the Athabasca tar sands.
I have a question now. W.A.C. Bennett, the premier who built all the rail into the northern part of
Yes.
British Columbia up at the East Lake, had the intention to continue that obviously into Alaska and through the Yukon, but it never happened. I was wondering if you could say a few words if you know anything
He
about
was undone a lot by his son.
how.
Bill Bennett undid the policies of his father, and I understand one of the reasons that his father died with a broken heart because of what his son did. He basically undid the policies, and in fact, they basically sabotaged the construction of the line from Minaret up to East Lake. So it was not finished. And then they proceeded to dismantle the whole thing, and it just was a very sad story, very sad. And I'm not sure if there was ever any mention in the Ireland, but it's a sad story. And the father was undone by the son. That's what I know. Maybe some of you might have something to say about that too, but that's what I know what's happened.
That was the same provincial government that privatized the maintenance of the highway.
Yes. Right.
And apparently some of it's so crazy now they even have a TV show. What they show on that is crazy.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.